When you start reading all four Gospels together, one thing immediately jumps out at you: the difference in the Gospel of John. I mean, John just sounds different. And there's a reason for that. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who focus on Jesus on earth and the human side of Jesus, and who was Jesus while he walked on the earth, John focuses on the divine nature of Jesus. He focuses on Jesus being God made flesh, the incarnation of the second figure of the Trinity. This is why John opens his gospel with those incredible words in John 1, 1 through 3, where he talks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was with God in the beginning, and it's through him that all things were made. John focuses on the very beginning. It's not enough for John to start at the beginning of Jesus' incarnation on earth. John goes all the way back to eternity to show us the divine nature of the Christ, how he's not just God's only begotten Son, but that he was indeed God incarnate, Emmanuel, God with us. Now, that's not to say John goes completely out into left field. He still follows a similar pattern with the other Gospels. Like with the first few chapters of Matthew and Mark and Luke, John focuses on the early days of Jesus' ministry, the baptism, the temptations in the wilderness, and most importantly, the beginning of the miracles. Now, the miracles are where the critics of the Gospels have the most problem. That is where they seem to balk at the believability of the four Gospels. We can't believe in the Gospel accounts because of the stories of the miracles. Why is that? Because people don't rise from the dead. People don't get immediately better after touching someone one time, or because somebody just said, get better, and immediately they get better. Crowds of 5,000 people aren't fed with just a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. And our answer to those objections should be, yeah, that's the point. That's why these miracles were such a big deal. That's why we call them miracles to begin with. Because these things don't normally happen. But that brings us to two of our important concepts this week: the concept of the expected and the concept of the unexpected. And as you're reading through your readings for the week, think about the idea of the expected and the unexpected. When we talk about the expected, if you're actually going to have God come down in the form of man, being fully man and yet still being fully God, still walking in perfect union and perfect community with his triune self, wouldn't you expect certain things to happen? What if Jesus had never healed anybody? What if Jesus had never walked on the water? What if Jesus had never raised anybody from the dead? Would that make the Gospels more believable? No. It would almost make them less believable, because if you're going to have God walking on the face of the earth, you would expect him to do something about the sickness around him, about the hunger, about the dead. You would expect for nature to bend to his will if he was still fully God. The fact that he was doing miracles was one of the things that drew people to him to begin with. It was one of the whole points of his existence here on earth. It was one of the whole purposes of his time here on earth. Jesus came to show man what the kingdom of the Messiah was to be like. It wasn't like anything they had previously known. Most of the people that are alive today never seen miracles before, because God had been silent with his dealing with Israel for hundreds of years. So generations upon generations upon generations never really had much of a spiritual experience until Jesus began walking the earth. And if God's going to walk the earth, you would expect things to happen. In many ways, that's what makes the Gospels believable. The fact that the dead were raised, the fact that the sickness was healed, the fact that crowds were fed in miraculous ways. It's one of the reasons he's kind of a big deal. But then you get to the idea of the unexpected. Because one of the things you would not expect God made flesh to do is to go off into the desert for 40 days and allow himself to be tempted. Think about the story of the temptation. Jesus being tempted 3 times, at least 3 times as recorded in the Gospels. When you think about the fact that Jesus had complete and total control over his situation, why did he allow himself to go out to the wilderness for so long? Why did God lead him out into that? Why did he allow himself to be tempted? It's one thing for Satan to show up, but it would have made total sense for Jesus just to shut him up before he even said a word and to send him away and not listen to anything he has to say. But instead, he allows himself to go through the temptation. That's unexpected. That is not what you would expect a God to do. Why would he allow himself to go through these situations? Why would he allow himself to go through these temptations? One of the important points of the baptism of Jesus was that he was identifying with sinful man. He continues to do so in the stories of the temptations. This is why Hebrews chapter 4 tells us that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us, but he knows exactly what we go through because he has been tempted in the same ways that we have been tempted. In fact, it says that he has been tempted in every way, all the ways that we have been tempted. There's not a single temptation, trial, there is not a single moment of spiritual warfare that we can go through that Jesus himself did not go through. This is why we can go to him in prayer. And this is why we have the great promise in the New Testament that there is not a single temptation that God will allow in our paths that he will not allow and make a way of escape for us. We are not tempted in such a way that we must sin. This is why we can look at the devil, resist him, and he will flee from us. Because we have a God who did something that was completely and totally unexpected. He experienced humanity, not just in his physical form, but it's in its spiritual and emotional state as well. If you're broken in heart, if you're broken in mind, if you're spiritually just on empty, God has walked in these footsteps also. He knows what it's like. We may not expect that from a God, but our God is the God of the unexpected.